Hello everyone, my name is Mr.Khổng. In today's video, we will explore one of the most tense periods in modern world history, the Cold War. In 1945, World War II officially came to an end with the complete defeat of the Axis powers. After 6 years of devastating conflict, many European countries were left economically exhausted, with their infrastructure severely damaged and their political influence greatly weakened. Former great powers, such as Britain and France, were no longer able to maintain the dominant positions they had held before the war. In this situation, the two nations that rose to become the most powerful were the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States possessed an exceptionally strong economy and suffered relatively little direct damage from the war on its own territory, while the Soviet Union emerged as a powerful military force after playing a crucial role in defeating Nazi Germany. However, the two countries represented two completely different political and economic systems. The United States followed capitalism, emphasizing a market-based economy and private ownership, while the Soviet Union followed the socialist model, highlighting the role of the state in managing the economy and society. The clash of interests, ideologies, and ambitions for global influence between these two superpowers created a confrontation that lasted for several decades, known as the Cold War. This was not primarily a conflict fought through direct military battles between the United States and the Soviet Union, but rather through an arms race, economic competition, diplomatic struggles, political influence, and regional conflicts around the world. After the Yalta Conference in February 1945, the leaders of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union met to discuss how to reorganize the world order after the war. One of the most important outcomes was the establishment of spheres of influence between the two major powers in Europe. Western European countries fell under the influence of the United States and its Western allies and developed according to the capitalist model. This system was based on a market economy, private ownership of property and means of production, and encouraged business activities, investment, and competition. However, this model also faced certain challenges, including economic inequality and social tensions between different groups within society. In contrast, Eastern Europe came under strong Soviet influence and gradually transitioned toward the socialist model. These countries developed economies based on state ownership or collective ownership of many key industries. The goal of this system was to reduce social inequality, limit the influence of the capitalist class, and move toward a society with greater equality among social groups. One of the most important flashpoints during the early years of the Cold War was Germany. After Nazi Germany surrendered, German territory was divided into 4 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Although Berlin was located within the Soviet-controlled zone, the capital city itself was also divided into separate sectors administered by the victorious Allied powers. The Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, developed along a capitalist path and received support from Western countries. In 1949, the 3 occupation zones controlled by the United States, Britain, and France were merged to establish the Federal Republic of Germany. In response, the Soviet Union supported the creation of the German Democratic Republic East Germany, which followed a socialist system and became one of the Soviet Union's most important allies in Europe. Later, the division between East Germany and West Germany became a clear symbol of the confrontation between the two opposing blocs during the Cold War, especially after the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. Alongside the division of the world into 2 rival camps, nations after World War II also made efforts to establish an international organization to prevent future large-scale conflicts. On April 25, 1945, representatives from 50 countries gathered in San Francisco, United States, to begin the process of creating the United Nations. The organization was established with the goals of maintaining global peace, protecting international security, promoting cooperation among nations, and addressing common challenges facing humanity. By 1947, the Cold War entered a more tense phase, and the United States announced the Truman Doctrine. Under this policy, Washington pledged to support countries that it believed were at risk of falling under communist influence. This was considered a major turning point, marking the beginning of the U.S. policy of containing the Soviet Union and preventing the further spread of communism. Soon afterward, the United States introduced the Marshall Plan, a massive economic aid program worth approximately $13 billion at the time, designed to help Western European nations rebuild after the devastation of World War II. Beyond economic recovery, the United States also hoped that the program would reduce the appeal of communist movements throughout Europe. The rivalry between the two sides was not limited to economics. It also extended into the fields of ideology and propaganda. The United States and Western nations launched campaigns criticizing communism, while the Soviet Union condemned capitalism and promoted the socialist model as an alternative system. In the economic sphere, the Soviet Union established the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance Comecon, also known as CMEA, in 1949 to strengthen cooperation among socialist countries in Eastern Europe. The organization aimed to promote economic collaboration, expand trade exchanges, and provide development assistance among nations within the socialist bloc. Therefore, within only a few years after the end of World War II, the world had rapidly become divided into two opposing camps, led by the United States and the Soviet Union. The rivalry between these two superpowers opened a nearly half-century-long era of major global changes, deeply influencing international relations throughout the 20th century. In addition to their political and economic confrontation, the United States and the Soviet Union also entered into intense competition in many other fields, including science, technology, space exploration, and especially military power. One of the most significant events that changed the balance of global power occurred on August 29, 1949, when the Soviet Union successfully conducted its first atomic bomb test. This event ended the United States' monopoly over nuclear weapons and marked the beginning of a dangerous arms race between the two superpowers. Also, in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO was established based on a military alliance treaty between the United States, Canada, and Western European countries. The main goal of this alliance was to strengthen collective defense capabilities against the growing influence of the Soviet Union in Europe. In response to the creation of NATO, the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies established the Warsaw Pact in 1955, creating two clearly opposing military blocs during the Cold War. Although they remained in a state of constant tension and fierce competition, the United States and the Soviet Union never directly went to war against each other. Instead of confronting one another on the battlefield, the two superpowers often provided weapons, financial support, military advisors, and logistical assistance to their allied nations, turning many regional conflicts into proxy wars between the two sides. In this way, each superpower attempted to expand its influence while avoiding the direct risk of triggering a global nuclear conflict. One of the earliest examples of proxy war during this period was the Greek Civil War. The Greek communist forces received support from the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, while the Greek government was backed by Britain and the United States. The conflict lasted for about 3 years and caused significant losses of life and property. However, due to disagreements with the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia gradually reduced and eventually ended its support for the Greek communist forces. In the end, government forces achieved victory, allowing Greece to join the Western Bloc of allied nations and become an important part of the strategy that contained Soviet influence in the Mediterranean region. In Asia, after the end of World War II, a fierce civil war continued in China between the nationalist forces led by Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese Communist Party led by Mao Zedong. In terms of the initial balance of power, the nationalists possessed a larger army, had access to more modern weapons, and received outside support. However, the nationalist government gradually weakened due to widespread corruption, prolonged internal conflicts, and growing public dissatisfaction after years of war. Furthermore, China's post-war economy fell into a severe crisis. The currency rapidly lost its value, inflation soared, and the living conditions of ordinary people became increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party focused on building its forces, expanding its influence in rural areas, and gaining strong support from a significant portion of the population. After about 3 years of intense fighting, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, the communist forces gained the upper hand and took control of most of mainland China. In 1949, the People's Republic of China was established, marking the victory of the Chinese Communist Party. The nationalist government, defeated in the Civil War, was forced to retreat with its remaining forces to the island of Taiwan. where it continued to maintain its government. The establishment of the new Chinese state brought a major shift in the global balance of power while also expanding the socialist bloc from Europe into East Asia. Following the victory in China, the Soviet Union continued to expand its influence in Asia by supporting Allied forces. On the Korean Peninsula, the Soviet Union provided assistance to the North Korean government and helped create conditions for it to launch an invasion of the South in 1950. With the goal of unifying the peninsula under its leadership, the North Korean army quickly broke through South Korean defenses, causing the situation to become increasingly serious, facing the possibility that South Korea could be completely defeated. The United Nations established an international military force with troops from 16 countries, with the United States playing the leading role. The UN forces launched a powerful counteroffensive, pushing the North Korean army back toward the north and advancing close to the border with China. This development caused China to fear that its national security was being threatened, leading Beijing to decide to send troops into the conflict under the justification of protecting its border security. More than 1 million Chinese soldiers entered the Korean peninsula and coordinated with the North Korean army to carry out large-scale counterattacks. By employing tactics based on overwhelming numbers of troops, Chinese forces inflicted heavy losses on the UN coalition and forced them to retreat southward. After years of intense fighting, both sides were gradually pushed back toward the area near the 38th parallel. The war eventually reached a stalemate and ended with the signing of an armistice agreement in 1953, dividing the Korean peninsula into two separate regions with two different political systems. After the Korean War, the United States continued to strengthen its policy of containing the global expansion of communism. In Indochina, the United States began supporting France in its efforts to maintain control over its former colonies, including Vietnam. However, under the leadership of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam government, along with support from the Soviet Union and China, Vietnamese resistance forces carried out a prolonged struggle against the French military. The climax of the conflict came with the victory at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, when Vietnamese forces defeated a heavily fortified French military stronghold. This defeat forced France to enter negotiations and sign the Geneva Accords, which ended France's military presence in Indochina. Afterward, France withdrew from Vietnam and its remaining colonies in the region. Concerned about the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, the United States quickly became involved in Vietnam by supporting the establishment of the Republic of Vietnam government in the south. Vietnam was subsequently divided into two opposing political zones: the north, controlled by a communist government, and the south, controlled by a government supported by the United States, with the 17th parallel serving as the temporary dividing line. By 1956, another international crisis erupted in the Middle East involving the Suez Canal, after Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser announced the nationalization of this strategically important waterway. Britain, France, and Israel coordinated a military campaign aimed at regaining control of the canal. Initially, the Allied forces achieved several successes and occupied important positions inside Egypt. However, the crisis quickly became a major issue within the context of the Cold War. The Soviet Union issued warnings and declared that it could support Egypt with military force, even raising the possibility of using nuclear weapons. This caused the international community to fear that a new global conflict could break out. Facing the escalating tensions, the United States pressured Britain, France, and Israel to halt their military campaign. Washington also used economic measures to increase pressure, including threats to reduce financial assistance and affect oil supplies to the countries involved in the conflict. Ultimately, the invading forces were forced to withdraw from Egypt. The Suez Canal crisis seriously weakened the international positions of Britain and France while demonstrating the increasingly dominant roles of the United States and the Soviet Union in shaping the global order during the Cold War. On October 4, 1957, the world was shocked when the Soviet Union successfully launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, into Earth's orbit. This achievement allowed the Soviet Union to regain the advantage in science and technology. In response, the United States introduced major educational reforms, expanded investment in scientific research, and established NASA. These efforts eventually led to the successful mission that sent the first humans to the moon. marking the beginning of a major space technology race between the two superpowers. In Latin America, the United States sought to establish the region as its own sphere of influence and ensure that communism would not gain a foothold there. However, in 1959, the Cuban Revolution succeeded, and a communist government was established under Fidel Castro. The U.S. Central Intelligence Agency CIA recruited Cuban exiles with strong anti-communist views to launch the Bay of Pigs invasion in an attempt to overthrow the Cuban government. The CIA also carried out nearly 638 assassination attempts against Cuban leader Fidel Castro, but all of them failed. The Bay of Pigs invasion ended in a disastrous defeat when Castro's government quickly mobilized troops and warships to defend Cuba. Later, the Soviet Union deployed medium-range missiles aimed directly at the United States, causing tensions to reach their highest point. The two sides prepared for a possible military confrontation, and the world anxiously feared the outbreak of a Third World War. However, through diplomatic negotiations, the Soviet Union agreed to remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. commitment not to invade Cuba again and to withdraw its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. Returning to Vietnam, the South Vietnamese government refused to recognize the Geneva Accords and rejected the proposed nationwide elections intended to reunify the country. At the same time, it implemented increasingly strict anti-communist policies, leading North Vietnam to support the establishment of the National Liberation Front of South Vietnam. The conflict intensified as both sides launched military campaigns, including guerrilla warfare and ambush operations, with support from the Soviet Union and China. The two sides fought fiercely for many years, and the war became increasingly brutal. The United States spent hundreds of billions of dollars on the Vietnam War, making it one of the most expensive conflicts in history. Within the United States, opposition to the war grew rapidly, and public criticism became increasingly intense as many Americans realized that the conflict was not developing as expected. As a result, the United States decided to withdraw its troops in 1973. 2 years later, communist forces achieved victory, and Vietnam was reunified after the end of the war. Following the Vietnam War, the Soviet Union gained opportunities to expand its political influence in Africa by providing support and funding to communist organizations and revolutionary movements across the continent, alongside the confrontations in Europe. One of the most serious flashpoints during the later stages of the Cold War was Afghanistan. In 1979, the Soviet Union sent its troops into the country in an attempt to support the communist government in Kabul, which was facing the threat of being overthrown by opposition forces. However, Moscow's military intervention encountered fierce resistance from Islamic guerrilla groups, commonly known as the Mujahideen. These forces received financial aid, weapons, and training from the United States, Pakistan, China, and several Western countries. China viewed the Soviet presence in Afghanistan as a major threat to regional security, particularly along its western border. Therefore, Beijing temporarily cooperated with Washington to provide assistance to anti-Soviet groups in Afghanistan. The prolonged conflict forced the Soviet Union to spend enormous amounts of manpower, financial resources, and military assets, creating a severe crisis similar to the one the United States had experienced during the Vietnam War. In Europe, tensions between the Eastern and Western blocs continued to escalate. France had previously withdrawn from certain joint NATO military operations due to disagreements with the United States, but it remained an important power in the European balance of influence. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued to modernize its nuclear arsenal, especially by deploying intermediate-range missiles capable of targeting Western Europe. In response, the United States and NATO also stationed additional missile systems in Europe. This development triggered a dangerous arms race, forcing both superpowers to allocate enormous defense budgets while neither side was able to achieve a decisive strategic advantage. In Central America, the United States also carried out a controversial military operation in Panama. Manuel Noriega, who had previously cooperated with the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency CIA during the period of opposition to communist influence, later became Panama's authoritarian leader and gradually moved into conflict with Washington. The U.S. government accused Noriega of involvement in drug trafficking, money laundering, and actions that threatened American strategic interests. In 1989, citing the need to protect democracy, combat drug trafficking and ensure the safety of American citizens, Washington launched a military operation codenamed Operation Just Cause, sending approximately 27,000 troops into Panama. The attack quickly led to the collapse of the Noriega government. Manuel Noriega was captured, extradited to the United States for trial, and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Following the operation, the United States continued to maintain its strategic interests and influence surrounding the Panama Canal. However, the U.S. military intervention received significant criticism from the international community, which argued that it violated Panama's sovereignty. Nevertheless, at that time, the Soviet Union had entered a period of severe decline and no longer had the capacity to respond strongly to international events. Decades of heavy military spending had placed enormous pressure on the Soviet economy, pushing the country into a deep financial crisis. The Soviet government was forced to reduce its support for many communist movements around the world and decided to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan in 1989. The war in Afghanistan was considered one of the major factors contributing to the weakening of Soviet power, as it resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of soldiers and cost billions of dollars. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union's system of alliances in Eastern Europe began to collapse rapidly. Movements calling for political reform, greater freedoms, and democratic elections spread throughout many countries in the socialist bloc. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, paving the way for the reunification of Germany after decades of division. Although Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reform policies such as perestroika and glasnost in an attempt to save the country, these efforts failed to prevent a widespread crisis. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, breaking apart into 15 independent republics. This event led to the collapse of the socialist system in Eastern Europe and brought an end to organizations such as the Warsaw Pact and the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance Comecon. The dissolution of the Soviet Union marked the end of the bipolar world order that had been established. After World War II, it's also allowed the United States to emerge as the most influential global power during the early years of the post-Cold War era. The NATO alliance not only survived but also continued to exist, expanded its membership, and became involved in various international security operations beyond its traditional role. Throughout the Cold War period, independence movements among colonized peoples also developed strongly across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Entering the 21st century, the majority of countries around the world had gained sovereignty and pursued their own paths of development. At the same time, the rapid growth of China, Japan, and Western European economies created major economic centers, significantly reshaping the global balance of power. Remarkable advances in science and technology accelerated globalization and increased the need for cooperation among nations. In this new era, the pursuit of peace, dialogue, and shared development has increasingly become a common goal of the international community. Thank you all for watching this video. Please share your thoughts in the comments section below about these important historical events. If you find this content useful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next exciting videos. See you again in the upcoming history topics.